everybody. I'm just going to welcome you to tonight's event. Thank you for showing up. We're excited to have a spirited but civil debate. So no holds barred, but please don't throw any actual punches. As always, I would like to thank our sponsors, Arcadium, Smashworks, Fresh Planet, and Take Two, and Avalanche. Nice, thank you for helping make Yeah. So tonight's event is going to be moderated by Heather Chaplin, who is a extremely well-known author, teacher, intellectual scholar on the subject of games, and someone who is kind of intimately familiar with this topic and was one of the co-conspirators in originally kind of like setting up this idea and making it part of the public discourse about games. So I'm going to hand it over to Heather Chaplin.
Oh, this works. Okay. I'm Heather. Thank you, NYU Game Center. Thanks, Frank, for having us, and thanks everybody for coming. I'm mostly going to turn it over to these guys, and I just would disagree with Frank a little bit. I think it would be great if you guys came to blows. Right? I mean, that would certainly spark things up. So let's see if we can get them riled up enough to actually attack. So I'm just going to frame a tiny bit with where I come from, which I think will lead into some of these ideas that Eric put out in his manifesto. So people always ask me, how did a nice girl like you, who's primarily interested in 19th century literature, and French history, get interested in video games? And the story really starts with my parents, who were hippies, and who dragged me along to a lot of alternative game festivals when I was a kid. And one of the ideas that just never left my mind that came out of these festivals was something that I've kind of paraphrased by saying, show me the games of your children and I'll show you the next 100 years. So when I was first approached about doing something about video games, I just thought, well, this is actually really interesting. This was back in 2001 when nobody in the mainstream press was really paying any attention to video games except that they were like this evil thing that was destroying youth. So I thought, well, this is really interesting. If games kind of play this organic role in culture, kind of preparing people for the skills that we need of them as adults, maybe this is really worth looking at. And my favorite example of this is the English archery law of 1252, which I'm sure you're all totally familiar with. So this was Edward III, right? He had discovered, or probably he didn't himself, but the longbow had been invented. And he said, wow, that is really something. So he passed the English archery law of 1252, which mandated that everybody had to play archery games on Sundays and on holidays, and he outlawed all other sports. And not long after that, he invaded France and started the 100-Year War. So you have to be careful with these things. But I just think that's like a great example of kind of what I'm talking about. So when I was first covering games, it was really, our games part of the mainstream. And then that really started changing around 2005, 2006, I feel like. And I started getting to know people like Eric and Frank and other people like Katie Salen and Jim G, who were really trying to look at, what is a game, and really go into this question of what kinds of skills and modes of thinking and ways of being do games foster. I think I first heard Eric talk about the idea of game literacies, which I just thought was fascinating. And so I guess it was around that time that Eric and I did a fireside chat at the
Games Learning and Society Conference.
Games Learning and Society. There's a lot of conferences in this. So the Games Learning and Society Conference, and sort of got very passionate talking about these ideas of, well, if games are really kind of the main way that young people are spending their leisure time, and that's the paradigm that they're working with more than a linear narrative, they're going to come out different kinds of people. So what might that look like? And the three things that intrigued me the most were this notion of systems thinking, of games as complex systems, that when you're engaging with a game, you're engaging directly with the processes of a system in a way that you're not necessarily with a book or a movie. The idea that everybody needs to know how to play. I interviewed John Seely Brown recently. I don't know if people know him. He's the former chief scientist of Xerox PARC, and he told me in the learning and dealing with the unknown. So I thought that was really interesting. And I always quote Peter Senge from the School of Management at MIT, who talks about systems thinking being the study of wholes rather than parts. And then the third idea being design, which at first I was a little skeptical about, but I'll quote Herbert Simon here, great thinker from the 1960s, who he summed up design, I think, really well by saying it was transferring from existing conditions into preferred ones. And I thought, well, I can go with that. So I guess this was an idea that we chatted about for a long time, and then Eric took it and ran and put out this manifesto, which I guess became a fairly controversial thing, which we're now here to debate and hopefully have a physical fight about. So the way we're going to organize this is let's have Eric talk for a couple minutes, and then I'll tell you a little bit about each person, and we'll debate their particular criticisms of Eric's manifesto, and then we'll open up the room at large. And I also just want to say I think it's very cool to go and find the people who told you you were full of shit and invite them to come into the room and have it out. I think that's awesome. So Eric, take it away.
All right, thanks, Heather. Thank you. I'm going to walk around a little bit. So, first of all, thanks for coming, and I agree with Heather. It's great to see you two here. And as a game designer, which is what I do for a living, I essentially stage productive conflict, right? That's what a game is, hopefully, at its best. And that's why we're here tonight, is to have some kind of conflict or clash of ideas that leads to somewhere else. So I just thought I would begin by trying to summarize the Ludic Century Manifesto and some of the ideas that are in that very short little essay. I started working on these ideas in 2006 with a group of literacy scholars that had been organized around what would later become GLS. People like Jim G., Constance Steinkler, and Kurt Squire, who are really academics coming from education and social sciences and literacy. And what we were thinking about is what Heather mentioned, which is this idea of gaming literacies. What is literacy? Well, literacy is the ability to create meaning and understand meaning. At least this is how it's been described to be by these literacy scholars. I'm not one of them myself. So for example, if I write a word on here and I show it to you, this is an act of literacy in the sense that I've created meaning, and then you guys have understood the meaning, and it's sort of this process of communication. Now, of course, language is very complicated and contextual, and literacy scholars have studied things like visual, not just reading and writing, sort of traditional idea of what literacy is, but visual literacy, technological literacy, things that are called procedural literacies or computational literacies that are actually really similar to the kinds of ideas that I explore in the Ludic Century Manifesto. Another strain of thinking that led to the manifesto was just really thinking about the times in which we live. And that if in the 20th century it is often thought of as an age of information, there was a sort of industrial revolution, and that was sort of replaced in thinking about very large, big historical epics by an information age. What came after that? What is following that? We can't necessarily still be in that. And so part of my idea of the Ludic Century was just thinking about what characterizes the times in which we live. And that led me to games. Now, of course, I'm a game designer, so saying that my personal form of expression, my life's passion, the thing that I like to do characterizes the times in which we live is obviously kind of myopic. But I did feel really that games had a special relationship to these times in which we're living. And if it's not games literally, then games are a way of understanding potentially what's special about the times in which we live. Heather mentioned the three concepts that are at the heart of the Ludic Century Manifesto, and they are systems, play, and design. So just to explain what I mean by each of those, our lives today are in the kinds of people that are in this room and in industrialized democracies are completely enmeshed in systems, right? The way that we work, the way that we learn and research, the way that we communicate, the way that we flirt and socialize, the way that we conduct our finances and connect with our governments, all of these fairly essential aspects of our lives are completely enmeshed in networks of information, digital systems. And so this idea of literacy, what it means to create meaning and understand meaning, in my mind, is really entrenched and interconnected with the idea of systems. In other words, we kind of have to be systems literate and systems thinkers to use software, to use a computer, to manage everything that you manage on your cell phone, like your address book and your minutes remaining, your signal strength, upgrading your system, all of these sort of aspects of managing our communications with other people. Now, games, I would argue, are the cultural form of systems. While it's true that every building is a system, and every song is a system, and every poem is a system, I would argue that games have a special relationship to systems, and from a certain point of view, they are a system. To play a game is to interact with a system, to play around with the inputs and outputs, to experiment with how the system behaves and sees what happens as a result, whether you're playing chess or basketball or SimCity. To play a game is to interact with the system. And I think that games have a special relationship to systems. And if our times in which we're living are in some sense defined by systems, then games have a special relationship to these times in which we live. And that gaming literacies are both a cause and effect of these times, right? That games become a way for us to practice these literacies, but at the same time, the preponderance of games, the economic and cultural rise of games as a major form of mass media and popular culture is a symptom of the way that systems are becoming more prevalent in our lives. Play is also really important. It's not enough to be able to analytically understand how systems work. We have to understand that systems are human systems that we inhabit. If you think about something like Wikipedia, that's a wonderful example of how in this Ludic Century, quote unquote, information has been put at play, right? So the 20th century, I would argue, was a century of the moving image. Now, of course, there were amazing things that happened in theater and music and architecture and other forms of cultural expression. But from a certain point of view, the major kinds of cultural stories that were told, the epic, mythic narratives, forms of personal expression, the way people got their news in the 20th century was really about film and television, the moving image. And film and television is a form of media that's characterized by a sort of linear progression of information that's absorbed by someone. I would argue that in this new age, which has already started, so I'm not saying it's coming, I'm saying it's sort of, we're already here, we're already in transition from the information age into maybe a ludic age. What's happening is that information has been put at play. And what I mean by play is evidenced by something like Wikipedia. So if you think about how massive amounts of information were stored in the 20th century, you had things like the Library of Congress or the Oxford English Dictionary. These are massive storehouses of information where there's a group of experts kind of curating what gets put into the storehouse, right? There are editors that decide every year how the English language changes and how they're going to make adjustments to the Oxford English Dictionary. Wikipedia, on the other hand, which in the last decade or so has become the most common way that people in these industrialized democracies get information and do research and find things out about the world, is not on that model. It's not on the model of a group of experts that are sort of the gatekeepers of information. Instead, Wikipedia is a system, but it's a human system. It's a messy system. It's a system where there's a blurry line between the people that are accessing the information, the people that are curating the information, in fact, and creating the information. In fact, there's even the way that people are allowed to change the information that's in Wikipedia itself is something that undergoes change and evolution. So it's this very organic, hard to understand, messy system. It's a human system. And that's sort of what I mean by play. That a system that's at play is a system that is changing and transforming, questioning itself, and turning into something new. Play is a way of thinking or an activity that, as Heather has quoted Seeley Brown, is about innovation, for example. And again, just like with systems, I think there's an intrinsic connection between, as with systems, there's a connection between systems and games. I believe there's also an intrinsic connection between play and games. I mean, games, again, are, it seems to me, the cultural form of play. Lastly is design. Yeah, I'll finish it up. So design is basically, design is a third part of these literacies, right? Ways of creating and understanding meaning. What it means to be literate in these times in which we're living. So design is really about the idea that we can't just be systems literate, we can't just play within these systems, but we need to be able to think of ourselves as being empowered to deconstruct, reconstruct, change, modify, and create our own systems. It's about changing our relationship as just consumers of media and culture and technology into producers. And I think that a design way of thinking is what's going to help us as we move forward. That there are, for example, massive problems in the world today that are not about sort of good guys versus bad guys, but they are about vastly complicated interconnections of different sorts of information. And the kinds of thinking that we do when we play games and understand how they work, and when we design them, is the kinds of thinking that we're going to have to do to solve these complicated problems like global environmental collapse, world poverty, pandemics, complex cultural conflicts that don't really have clear sides of right and wrong, or sort of binary oppositions intersecting with each other. So games, again, I would say, are a cultural form that emphasizes design. And to play a game deeply, you have to think more and more like a designer, which I would argue is different than film. That you can become a film connoisseur or film fan, a film buff. That doesn't mean that you understand, for example, the 180-degree rule, whereby that you can't put the camera on the other side of two people having dialogue because they'll visually flip on stage. Those kind of structural rules of film, you can be a huge film fan and never understand that. But as you play a game deeply, you actually do deconstruct the system of the game. You do have to think more and more like a designer. So again, there's a relationship between games and design that I think is interesting, an interesting, unique connection. Okay. So just to finish up, I would say that these ideas around the Ludic Century, systems, play, and design. I'm not saying that games are going to define the century. I'm not saying that everyone is going to have to be a game designer or a gamer, but I think that games are one way, for me, a really useful way of understanding these cultural changes that are happening. And the Ludic Century Manifesto, in its playful, bombastic way of taking on this ridiculous form of a manifesto, was my way of sort of exploring and also communicating these issues to the world. Thank you very much.
So then we have Abe Stein over here, and he says, what are you talking about? Do you want to say who you are first?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, I'm Abe Stein. I, for some time, worked at the MIT Gambit Lab, MIT Game Lab, and I write for Killscreen occasionally, which is a skill call, because I wrote a thing for Killscreen.
Right. So Abe sees this goes out on Kotaku, and Abe says, who is this we that you're talking about? He says, we must consider how such claims support the positioning of a broader games industrial complex that reinforces hegemonic notions of games as a commodity, which is some heavy shit.
I wrote that.
So I'm just going to open it with that. So Abe out there was saying, no, this doesn't work. There's some fundamental problems here with the argument. There's some things that you are not thinking about.
Yeah, I'll pick that up. I'll just kind of start off to just say thanks to Frank and kind of everyone here at the Game Center and all of you folks for showing up, for having this. It says a lot that we're here still talking about it, and I think that's actually a really important point. The fact that this discussion is still happening says a lot about the piece itself and the power of the piece, how provocative it is. So I'm just really, I'm really glad that you guys wrote it. Heather's trying to get out. She's like, I wasn't involved, and I'm like, no, co-conspirator was the right term. I was a little nervous when Frank emailed me at first because I was like, oh yeah, sounds like fun, and then I was like, oh no, I'm being brought in as the WWE heel, right? I'm going to be the Andre the Giant to your Hulk Hogan.
Hey,
Or the Jake the Snake to your Macho Man. So I was worried about that, and it's especially interesting because to be completely honest with you, there's so much that I agree with about the manifesto.
We don't want to hear about that.
Yeah, but we're going to gloss over all of that and jump right into the things that I disagree with. And so, yeah, I'm here because of the piece, The Uncomfortable Politics of the Ludic Century, that I wrote for Kill Screen. And I really kind of, I focused, I think, on two issues in that piece, and so I'm just going to kind of talk about those two issues in order. The first was kind of a response to this suggestion that's throughout it, but especially in the second point on the manifesto that says digital technology has given games a new relevance. To give you even just a little bit more background, a lot of my work is on sports media, is on sports fandom, and then subsequently sports video games. So I come from a background where I'm looking at sports a lot. And so, you had me games range, and I was like, yes, all right, I'm on board now. Like, I'm chugging along, this is good. And then we get to digital technology is giving games new relevance, and I slammed on the brakes a little bit. And so I'm kind of always sort of thinking about the ways in which games, which are obviously a very old thing, are either complicated or disrupted in some ways by digital technology. And so some of the questions I came up with, or some of the things I was wondering about, was about this notion of the proliferation of digital technology, because it's not as widespread as we might imagine. There are lots of people who don't have easy access to the internet, even in our own country, let alone throughout the world. There are lots of people for whom the limited access that they do have to digital technology is not being used for playing games, and maybe games aren't even necessarily an option on the platforms that they have. We live in a world where feature phones. You guys remember those? Like, you flip it open and you can actually play games on those, which is cool. But a lot of the world still has feature phones and not smartphones. And so the first thing that comes to my mind is, okay, so what exactly is this digital technology that's giving new relevance to games, and to whom? Who are the people out there for whom this digital technology is really changing things? And we can see probably for a lot of the people in this room, that's the case. It's likely why you're here. But again, I was sort of thinking, when we use these kind of statements about massive paradigm changes, historically we need to think about, okay, for who? And even in America, that's a problematic thing. I will also say about digital technology that the proliferation is not democratic. It is complicated by questions of access, and that's both material and cultural access, right? There are gatekeepers that sometimes are really obvious and sometimes are not. Having a computer to be able to access a Facebook account so that you can play a game on Facebook, those are barriers that you have to get through, which is sometimes material, like do you have a computer, and sometimes it's do we have Facebook in China, right? And so there are questions about that, and so we always kind of need to keep asking, who are the guardians of these digital technologies? Who controls your internet access, right? Internet's not free. We don't all just sort of like, yeah, hey, the internet's there, let's all just jump on it, right? You pay for something that gets you on the internet. Even if you don't think you do, you're like, oh, my city has free Wi-Fi. Well, who pays for that free Wi-Fi in the city, right? There are people who are paying taxes. That money's coming from somewhere. All of this is part of this, what I call games industrial. Maybe it's not games industrial, but it's all part of this kind of industrial complex of commodification. I joked on Twitter, I was like, I'm not a communist, but I play one on the internet. So I'm taking my internet performance to the stage today. But I am always sort of thinking about that kind of access. And like I said, the proliferation is not democratic. It's not that everybody gets it. And I think even you suggested in your post that there's kind of this hand-me-down process, and I think I ripped on One Laptop Per Child, that amazing Nicholas Negroponte, that was a sarcastic amazing, project out of the Media Lab that was going to bring computers to the world without actually thinking about does this culture want computers for the reasons that we want computers? And that's a major question too, is how do people want to interact with this technology? We can't assume that they're going to want to interact with the technology in the same sort of ways that we do. And so these are very kind of large global questions about it. And so that was sort of the first point I made. But then I was like, all right, so okay, let's just assume, let's suppose that the manifesto is right, that we are in this new paradigm, this new, I guess, edge of the information age, moving out of the older information, linear narrative age of film and TV, And we're all kind of thinking about games in new ways and engaging in games with new, engaging with games in new ways. Well, so the question then becomes, who has access to these games that are connected to these digital technologies that usher it in, right? So we can get at that and talk about that a little bit. There's also this thing that I think about that comes from my sports brain, which is sports are a very problematic domain, and sports are games too, keep in mind, where they've been commodified in a very interesting way, right? The spectacle of sport is the commodity. You pay to watch it on television, you pay to go to the event, you buy the jersey of the player that you love, right? Which is part of that sports media industrial complex, because you are aware of that player, because you are engaging with the media that allows you to know about what they're doing, right? So the spectacle of the sport has been the commodity and less so the play. And so that's an interesting thing. Board games are kind of a next step, right? Or a different sort of step, where I can buy a board game, and I'm buying the rules and I'm buying all the pieces that allow me to play it. Hypothetically, if I know the rules of that game, right? Like if I know the rules of chess, or if I know the rules of some board game I buy, I could hobble together all of the pieces. So what am I paying for in that sort of commodity situation? I'm paying for the luxury of having something put together for me. Of course, we have some interesting and complicated intellectual property laws about that as well, right? Can I actually just take someone's rules? Can I take Unity and Quantum and rewrite the rules and package it in a different way and sell it? It's complicated in that sort of way. So that's a next step in terms of the commodification of a game and a commodification of play. But then with digital games, it's this even kind of next step, right? Where we've got code. We've got code that is executing the game and allowing you to play with it. And it's like moving you to that next step of marriage, where the game is now becoming even more inextricably linked to the object, to the commodity in some sort of way, whether that object is code, whether that object is a disk that you buy, that you plug into your machine. And so we kind of move into a different space of how are you buying games, right? And so if the Ludic Century is an era of games and a period of games and game thinking that is inspired by digital technologies, well, it's all now wrapped up in the system of commodification that's moved us into these digital games that have moved us farther away from games which are free, or games which are free to be played in any sort of way. And so that's just an interesting question. Do all cultures think about games in the same way? This is an interesting leap when we talk about people will be thinking about the world as designers. People will be engaging with the world, thinking about it in terms of games. I'm not comfortable assuming that all cultures think about games in the same way, and that all cultures engage with games in the same way. I think historically, in terms of a game like lacrosse, which was in part a metaphor for war, it was a ritualized enactment of war. It was more than just a metaphor. It was a symbolic, physical performance of a ritual of war in a game form. And that's kind of an interesting, different way culturally to think about games than say Farmville. There may be some connections, but it's different. And so it's important to always think that maybe other cultures think about games in a different way and engage with games in a different way, and think about even the idea of design in a different way. Maybe they conceive of game design very differently. And so coming at this from an approach of we will all be thinking like designers now is problematic when you start to open it up and say, okay, well, what cultures are going to be thinking this way? And then I'm kind of sad that McKenzie Wark is not here for this point, but I completely agree actually that games can address our problems. And I do think actually that systems thinking and addressing the world in this way, because we are in, McKenzie has a good point. It's sort of like, it's all a game at this point, right? We're all constantly in a world of game now, and so you need to be able to engage with it. And so I do actually think that we can address a lot of our problems, but I'm a little less utopian about it. And I know the manifesto was you see, this is when I'm supposed to be like kicking over a chair, right?
Okay.
Not less apologetic. But,
Nice.
okay, sorry. Games can also very much complicate our problems as well. And this is where a lot of stuff with sports background comes from, or comes from my experience with studying sports and looking at sports. Sports is a very complicated domain, and a lot of the culture wrapped around those games complicates things. We can look at the cases of bullying that's going around right now, the notions of macho-ness that we're dealing with, notions of masculinity versus and gender in sport, right? And that's all just in the sports domain. But consider drones. Right? Drones are video game war. That's an example of that's an example of games not solving our problems, not giving us a solution to hunger or giving us a solution to water. It's giving us a solution to having a person in an airplane dropping a bomb, which is a solution for some people, right? But it can complicate things. And so, I mean, I think it's important to think of it that way. Last point, yeah, and this is really my last point. Like I said, I agree with so much of the manifesto, and most of my approach was kind of these kind of big questions that are always kind of the background I come from, and poking at kind of these grand meta-narratives, right? But the biggest question I have is why now? What is it about now that makes this the Ludic Century? What is different? We have always had games. The manifesto says it. Games are ancient. We have always had systems. That our body is a system. They've always been around. If the answer to why now is digital technology, then we have to confront the question of who has the access to the digital technology, who controls the access to the digital technology, and then how does that inform power relationships between cultures. And so I think if the answer to why now is digital technology, then I don't think I'm comfortable with the Ludic Century.
So, Abe was at MIT. He's obviously super smart.
No, it's not.
But I feel like there was so much in there, all the way from this that we should always pay attention to who we need when we say we. Questions of questions of access, and even more than access. There's a lot of research that shows that people with different socioeconomic groups display very different levels of being comfortable and being able to take advantage of stuff online, even if they have access. And then also this important question of what happens when it becomes commodified. So I feel like those were sort of the key points in there. So 5 minutes. Anybody want to respond to that or take them down? Sorry, does anybody want anybody?
Anybody have it?
Anybody?
Wasn't this supposed to be a debate of some kind?
Yeah, I'm just teasing you.
All right. Yeah, Abe, thanks for that rehash of your article. I really, was that bad?
No, I mean, that's all I did.
Summary? Is there something derogatory in the word rehash? I like it. Everyone's just spoiling for a conflict here. I see some of my former students in the crowd. You guys know that one of the things I always say is that thoughtful criticism is the highest form of respect. So I'm the masochist for criticism. I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why I would sort of throw something out there in the world that's like a magnet for people to critique as much as the Ludic Century Manifesto. I mean, I think you said a lot of interesting things. I think one of the big things is about what is there something different about this time in which we're living today? And like I said, I have to really, when I think about okay, where did that come from? It really did come from these conversations I was having with these literacy people, like Jim G, who in my mind is still the most interesting person who's been writing about games and learning for a long time. And he's not someone saying, hey, make an educational game. He's someone that says, hey, here's what a good game teaches you as you're playing it. Any game, a commercial game designed for entertainment. And their whole thing is, hey, schools are kind of being dragged back into the 19th century with standardized testing and No Child Left Behind. They're trying to improve education on a classroom level, on a policy level, on a theories of education and learning level. And then meanwhile, we're headed into new territory where there are new kinds of learnings that are necessary. What are they? What are these new? And the United Nations, I believe, has created these 21st century literacies. And there's a lot in common with what's going on in the Ludic Century Manifesto. But if I were to answer your question directly, I would say one thing about games that is different than the ancient history of games is that games have become authored culture. And that is something that's really new in the last 100 years or so. I mean, starting the late 19th century, or really early 20th century, we started having individual authors for games. And for all of the thousands and tens of thousands of years before that, games were folk culture. I'm sure there are some exceptions that can prove the rule. But in general, this is kind of something new, that this systemic form of culture starts to be authored by individuals working as auteurs. It seems to me that that's a weird, interesting kind of major shift in games. Now, the other thing is technology, And at the Games for Change conferences for about 3 or 4 years running, Frank, Lance, and Karen Seidman used to do this little Frank and Karen show, Suzanne Segerman called it, where you guys would talk about systems and how systems are somehow becoming a deeper part of our culture. And you guys always said, well, it's related to technology, but it's also something that goes beyond digital technology. And they would sort of report on things like weird internet memes and the way they spread, or systems of understanding how you can have kidney donations. And it's this very complicated system where I can get a kidney from someone, then like all of this sort of passing around, because not everybody is compatible with everyone else. So you had to set up these big donation networks where like overnight all these kidneys would like be transferred from some people to another person. That also influenced me. I really do think that there is something sort of in the air, in the water, and the rise of digital technology is, like I said, it's both a symptom and a cause and an effect, you know, of all of these things. But I agree with you. I mean, I don't want to let non-digital games be left behind. But I do, like you talked about sports and spectacle, for example. I think that that spectacle itself is also undergoing a change. If you look at what has happened to the image, the idea of the image, the photographic image, in the last 50 years or so, it's turned digital, right? It's changed from something that experts create, expert illustrators, expert photographers, and that you purchase in magazines and books. And now that more and more, there's just this huge tidal wave of images being created by everyone, everywhere, at all times. There's something shifting, right, in this idea of the relation to producers and consumers.
I have to jump in because, so I mean, again, this is kind of a simple example, but even saying that the image has dramatically changed in some sort of global way, yes, there has been some change, but there's a thriving film scene in Nigeria that is on VHS. It is not digital, and their practice is defined by the technology of videotape that they're using. And you can see it as like, people who are really into like Hollywood and Joss Whedon are like, oh, what primitive movies by these Nigerians on VHS, but it's not primitive, it's different. It's different because they're informed, and they have traveling vans with TVs on them that bring them from location to location to show them, because theaters is only one vehicle and one domain for watching them. And so I think it's just too hard to kind of paint in these techno-utopian sort of broad strokes of like, look what we can do now. Well, some people can do that now if you can afford Photoshop, which has gotten cheaper now that you can do the cloud thing, right? Hooray, which is still, $100 a month. Like, I don't even know, but that's money, right? That's real money. So I
use GIMP.
Which, yeah, sound big. Free
But I do, but even VHS tapes, I mean, I'm the last person to kind of go into an evolution of digital technologies and say that technology drives anything. I'm a campaigner against like the idea of the progression of technologies making games more immersive, for example. I'm a throwback when it comes to the kinds of games that I make. I've been making large-scale architectural physical games with Manifesto, for example. But I do think that there's something interesting with digital technology. You mentioned McKenzie Wark. One of the things that struck me from his book, The Hacker Manifesto, is he talks about capital and the way that money abstracted value. So that before there was money, people were kind of bartering, and an axe was worth an axe, right? And a loaf of bread was worth a loaf of bread, and you can sort of barter based on a contextual situation. And something weird happens with abstraction, where you have money, and suddenly there's this kind of abstract value that can be applied to everything. So there's some connection there in terms of how information became digital and abstraction, and there's some idea that's both. I think that's both. It's both liberating because it allows you to do things like exchange stuff, and then it also becomes terrifying at the same time because it alienates us from the labor that we do, and it also creates systems of impoverishment and severe imbalances of power and that kind of thing. But I do think that something like that's going on in information as well. And that's, for example, with images and games, and there's something about the abstraction of ones and zeros that is somehow like a major parallel with the abstraction of value and money.
Fascinating point. Let's leave it there. for a second and bring Ben into the conversation. So Ben pops his head up and he says they're both wrong. Fundamentally flawed. I love how people on the internet just go for it, right?
Yeah.
Fundamentally flawed. I think my favorite thing about Ben's piece, he'll probably touch on this, but he brings up a hero of mine, the great labor leader, Joe Hill. I don't know if people are familiar with him.
I was not planning to address that specific point,
So
but I'd like to.
let me just say, I love this.
Now
He
I
says-
kind of have to.
He brings up how Joe Hill, who was a big labor activist, he made up the phrase pie in the sky because he was talking about the Salvation Army people who would go around to poor people living in terrible working conditions and say, don't worry about this stuff because one day you're going to be up there in the sky and get a whole song about it and everything's going to be great. So that's where the phrase pie in the sky came from. And Ben says that Eric's Manifesto is a Salvation Army sermon. Pretty harsh.
That's quite the intro.
And then he complains that Abe is missing the point that digital games are a catalyst for Ludic Century. He says games can only bring about a Ludic Century if they catalyze a renaissance of Ludic thinking. And that Ludic thinking is not, I feel what I feel, but I go through what I go through. Ben, explain yourself.
Okay. So thanks to Frank and Dylan who emailed me and NYU, and especially thanks to people who came in late because you'll probably agree with me more. So let's see. Yeah. So I wrote this on my Tumblr, which is not updated very often, and I love that people actually visit my Tumblr to read it. But I kind of started out I actually read Eric and Abe's pieces some amount of time apart, and so I initially kind of read the Manifesto, and I wasn't sure who was supposed to who was the intended audience of this piece, who is supposed to be listening to this, when you think about manifestos in history, there's basically two kinds. There's manifestos that sort of they provide a revelation about the world we're already living in, and these tend to be religious manifestos. And then there are manifestos that provide a vision of the future and tell us how to get there. They have a call to action in them. And the example that I use of a religious manifesto is not actually a religious manifesto, it's the Cyberpunk Manifesto, which tells us all about, in 1996, how we were living in the age of cyberpunk. And I think we all agree that is true. But then there are lots of manifestos like Dogme 95 about how to make films, or the Futurist Manifesto about how to be fascist and Italian. Or the Ultraist Manifesto about how to write Spanish poetry. That there are all these manifestos that sort of like they lay out this blueprint for this glorious world we can walk into. And I didn't really feel I felt like Eric's the manifesto is talking about the future. It's talking about the 21st century, which none of us in this room will get to find out if Eric's actually right. We'll all be dead by the time, the way that we can talk about, because it will be a Ludic century like the 20th century was the information century. So what does it mean to be sitting in 2113 and looking back on the 21st century and saying, oh man, that was totally a Ludic century, if ever there was. So that was kind of where this came from. And then I read Abe's piece, and I mean, yeah, that my main my beef with that, I guess, is just that I think that we're too stuck. It would be like trying to talk about the information century and arguing about, well, we'll never have enough telegraphs. Nobody's going to learn how to tap out the signals, and you can only talk to one person at a time. So how am I supposed to know what all of my friends are saying on Twitter when I have to tap it out individually to each of them? We don't know what the Ludic century ends up as. We just know how it starts out. So if we assume that the 21st century is a century of play, of games, as this sort of cultural force that changes all of society the way that information changed the 20th century. It's not just that, oh man, there's a lot of games everywhere. It's that games changed everything. So when we think about the way that information changed our society, ideas like meritocracy, which is kind of couched in this idea that you can get enough information about like what people are good at, and then organize like, and you can judge people based on that information you got about them and tracking their stats, and then you can arrange society that way. Or technocracy is a replace for bureaucracy, where you get like subject matter experts, and you just install them into parts of government that they ought to know how to run because they're experts at whatever particular field you're talking about, right? Like these are ideas that would have been, you know, insane when you're like talking about who has the mandate from heaven to properly govern, you know, this segment of the world. So like, what does that even mean? The digitization that we are stuck on, it matters because for those of us who sit on sort of the fat side of the digital divide, games are omnipresent for us. Like, there's a game, one of the more popular games to come out in the last couple of decades was created because somebody was standing in line at a game convention and thought it would be really cool if there was a game that you could play while you were waiting to play another game. That game is Magic the Gathering. It did pretty well, and a lot of people seem to like it. You know, and it's weird that we live in a world where like that was an idea, like that was a problem that needed to be fixed. It was like there's so much time between now and my next game. What if I could fill that with a game? So what this kind of got me thinking about was like, if we were to be standing at the end of a Ludic Century, looking back, like, what would we, like, why did it matter? Why, like, how did we get past the digital omnipresence of games for rich people and turn that into something that, like, that changed the world in the way that, you know, the people who, this is the part where I'm uncomfortable with my own thoughts, because, one of the assumptions that I make is that there is an extent to which there is a sort of trickle-down culture, and that the people who are the power brokers, how they think is how you have to approach them. That's sort of foundational to where I'm going to take this, which is basically to say that when you get rich and powerful people growing up in an environment where they're constantly surrounded by games, and their experience of life is colored by this desire to experience things directly, not to watch them on TV, not to read about them in a book, but to experience them personally, to have that lived-in experience of a particular issue or way of thinking. That when you start having people who that's the world they come from, you need to present them, like, for them to understand something means to have walked that mile in a person's shoes. So you need to figure out how to present the things you want to those people if you want what they have. So, like, to get slightly more specific, I want to, like, if I was giving a talk about this, now is where I would introduce the concept of Nordic LARP. Yeah, which I don't have enough time to do. But basically, so if you're familiar with what LARP is in general, which if you're not, it's people in pointy hats throwing beanbags at each other saying lightning bolt. It's actually not that at all anymore. There has been since the 80s in Northern Europe this group of people who have slowly been kind of like sanding down this idea of what a LARP is and turning it into something that is a lot more sort of personal and not really, doesn't feel like anything we would associate with video games. As an example of what I'm talking about, there are LARPs that have been run that are about things like immigration policy, where these people, like, you know, half the people who show up are you know, immigrants from, you know, from parts of Africa or the Middle East, and the other, you know, they're playing these roles, and the other parts of them are the immigration service, who's like trying to figure out what to do with them. And, you know, these people who are immigrants live as these people in these personas for, like, you know, 2 or 3 days, like over the course of a weekend. They sleep in cement floors or on cots, you know, there's not enough beds to go around. Like, there's this sort of, the derogatory term for this might be emotional tourism, where, you know, you get to be a wealthy first worlder, you know, Monday through Friday, but you're like a weekend poor person. You know, but and like there is this sense of like verisimilitude right now we have this idea that what's the point of information? The information is supposed to tell us what's actually going on, what's true, right? Like that's why we get all this data, is so we can figure out what the hell's actually going on. And what this Ludic Century says is that no, that's not enough. You can't just know what's going on. You have to experience what's going on in order to really understand. At the Different Games Conference, which happened over across the river at the Game Innovation Lab at NYU Poly back in, I want to say April, that feels right. There was Maddie Grice, who is a game developer and a writer. She has this quote that I love, which is, I'm going to make you go through what I go through, which might be abusive, since I'm a marginalized individual. And I think that language is I'm very particular about that. It's not, I don't want you to see what I see. I don't want you to feel what I feel. I want you to go through what I go through. And what's special about that is when you go through what I go through, I don't necessarily know what you take from it, right? I'm not guaranteed that you saw what I saw or that you even responded to it emotionally the way that I would. There might be something that's really painful for me, and your life is just so outside gonzo what my perception of reality is that you feel it, and you're like, whatever, you know? And that's legit, right? And I have to accept that if you were in some sort of simulacrum of my life. But where this takes us is to a place where if there is this level of understanding that we start to desire through experiencing things, sort of like really sort of living in another person's life for a couple of minutes or hours or for a weekend or a week, that what we pull from that, in LARP there's this idea called bleed. And there's bleed in and bleed out. Bleed in is when aspects of your real life affect the character choices you make. And then bleed out is sort of the psychic echoes of things that happen to you in the game of impacting your life afterwards. So if you were living in terrible conditions, you are a lot more sensitive to the people you see honestly living in terrible conditions. But
Tell you to wrap up?
Yep. Okay. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that a world in which we do this is interesting to me because it gives this power to verisimilitude, or as Stephen Colbert might say, truthiness. Not that it's the enemy, because the information century says truthiness is the enemy, but that there is something there that is important and vital and human, and games give us access to that in a way that information alone can't. And I think that if we're going to be here 100 years from now, because Ray Kurzweil was right, that when we're all talking about the Ludic Century that it will be because of something like that, more so than just because we all had totally sweet phones.
I'm going to jump on a ton of that, if I may.
Yep.
Now it's going to get hot. So if the suggestion is that now we have the notion of experience this, don't see it, I would take umbrage with that, because we have been having students carry around sacks of flour pretending they're babies for a long time, right? We've had that expression, you walk a mile in my shoes forever. So maybe you're jumping on the idea that Eric has, which is aha, except now games are authored, right? Now we have these authored experiences which are games, and I would say no, we have always had authored games. All we have now is an ideology which attaches the author to a game as commodity, because we have been pushing more and more the idea of a game as a commodity, and in so doing, we've now protected the author through intellectual property and said, no, you're not playing Call of Duty unless you're playing the Call of Duty, or you're not playing this game and you're just playing, the very version of this game, right? A person can create and design rules. Rules are a totally abstract thing, right? You put them all together. I'm saying this to a room of game designers. I'm going to be running out of the building. But, you have intellectual property that protects, the intricate connection of rules, and these are totally abstract. In fact, sometimes I think they're not a thing until they're played, and then who's the author, right? I mean, if rules are totally abstract until someone executes it by literally playing it, who is the author in this situation, right? So we're talking about an ideological shift. So if the ideological shift is what's making this the Ludic Century, then we're just reinforcing power dynamics that say, if you can afford it, you've got the access.
Well, see, I would have a different critique of, I think that's a great point. I'd have a different critique of Ben's final idea about this experiential thing. For me, games are not about seeing something through someone else's eyes. I mean, I think that that's a great use of media and culture in general. I was trained as a painter, and you know, for me, that idea of the classic art object is something that, you know, you're just this traditional situation. You're in a white box of a gallery, and there's an image there that you interact with, but in a kind of contemplative, cognitive, emotional, psychological way. For me, when I went more into interactive media and then really games, it's almost like you arrive at the same picture, you arrive at this white box or gallery, and instead of like an object there, an authored thing that's made, it's more like a toolbox has been left for you. And you open it up and you start seeing what you can do, what's inside, what can I do with this? Now, I know that that's not all games. The games are, you know, I've often said in writing and in person, games are not one thing, they're many things. And anytime anyone starts telling you games are X, you need to start getting extremely skeptical. So even my toolbox metaphor is its own little subset of my own way of thinking about games. But to me, in general, what distinguishes games from other media is not that they allow you to experience something from someone else's point of view, but instead that like they are a thing that you do stuff with. That they are, it's like a toolbox that you open up and make things with. Frank himself has had an excellent, interesting critique of this idea that where's the Citizen Kane of games? Well, that assumes what Frank calls the message model of media. That media, games, art, entertainment, popular culture are about a genius author who creates a work. The work contains a message, and then through this medium of a book or film or music or game, it somehow reaches its audience here on the other end of this chain of meaning. And Frank's interesting critique of that is maybe games are different. Maybe games aren't about these master works where there's a genius auteur who's communicating an idea. What is that other thing? We don't know, but maybe it's more like the toolbox. It's something that you take apart and do stuff with. Now, if that's true, while there is all of this kind of commoditization, somehow within games, maybe there's the seeds for new models of a relationship to the media in which we produce. In music, most of us consume music by listening to it. That's played by musicians, right, in some ways, or DJs or producers, whoever. In games, we use that same word play, and while it's true that there's spectatorship in sports, the direct audience for games are the people that are actually playing, right? So that it's almost as if in an orchestra, you'd have the audience on stage, right? And so like there's no real difference between the people playing and listening to the music, because in a game, the players are the people appreciating the game. Except of course sports, which breaks that whole metaphor.
Yeah.
But I would say that in digital games and the new kinds of games, this is a kind of interesting thing that's going on. So I don't know, that would be my critique of that. I also think there's some interesting ideas there about the critique of the manifesto, right? What does it mean to write a manifesto? I would say that my idea of where we are in this Ludic Century is that I'm trying to describe something that to me has clearly already started. We're sort of in the thick of it, and it's also taking us somewhere where we're not going to see. So I'm not saying like, in 100 years this is what's going to happen. I'm actually trying to describe where I am right now. And it's kind of ridiculous and bombastic to even say I'm writing a manifesto, but the opposite is true, that it's very kind of personal. It's very much about my own experience as a designer in the cultural milieu that I come from. And maybe it's sort of, and that I think is one answer to a lot of the critiques that, yeah, it's not addressing everywhere in the world, everywhere at once. In fact, you might even say that the most of the manifestos that Ben mentioned, it's a great kind of list of them, none of them were meant to address all of the world's problems and speak for everyone in the world all at once. In fact, all of those manifestos are for a very specific kind of cultural practice.
So I would suggest that we open it for melee style now.
Like 5 seconds
Oh.
though. Really quick on
Yeah.
what I said. So, and I've been thinking about this for a long time, but one of the reasons we may grapple with this notion of games as message and games as community, we've had this stupid fight about games as art forever, is because maybe games aren't, someone a long time ago said games are a medium, and maybe they aren't in fact a medium. Maybe that's not the case, right? Maybe software is a medium. Maybe a board and bits and jits
Right.
are a medium, right? But a game is an activity. A game is a process. So that's the one idea. And then, oh crap. Oh God, I got really excited about that idea, and then I forgot my second idea.
I agree. The game is a cultural form, but
Yeah.
Well, actually, I remember hearing Frank talk about that. You said that was a huge misconception that games were a medium, that spaces in which people interact, and it just doesn't have that great a ring to it. Anyway, I think we should go melee style. So who wants to jump in on this? Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about technology. Hi, my name's Greg. We talked a lot about technology, and we talked a lot about barriers to entry. Can you speak to the people that are being sort of groomed for this Ludic Century? If you put yourself in ancient Rome and you had the Colosseum and the games, they work for the people. They work for the emperor. He had it built so that he could sit in the shade in his Colosseum. Now, on my day job, I'm building games to chase the dollar, not as a barrier to entry, but to chase the dollar to actually get paid, for retired people and for housewives and people that are not me. I'm not trying to share an experience. I'm trying to get paid. Weekends and nights I do my games. But can you speak about the people that might be sort of groomed for this Ludic Century? Because we are making games for them that I might not experience in the same way.
I'd be happy to. I think that's a really interesting question. Now, again, I think that if there's one person who's the single most original inspiration for this, although Heather and I had many conversations over the years too, it's James G. And that dude is like retirement age academic. I have seen him get very hot around the collar on certain issues around policy and democratic access to education. And so he is someone I've learned a lot from in terms of educational policy and where things are pulling. And a lot of what I would call right-wing educational policy, like ideas of school choice and vouchers, standardized testing, it's policies that sort of punish schools that are doing badly and reward schools that are doing well. These are things which kind of which create division and create this idea that there are some great schools that are doing it well and other schools that are kind of creating the service classes. And Jim G believes that there actually are policy people, politicians who directly or indirectly really believe that they want to create an unequal society because inequality is a kind of natural state of things. So my ideas align more with Jim G, which is really about trying to say, how do you create models for education that counterbalance that and that aren't about reinforcing inequality? And I think that going to this idea of literacy, it's almost like going below education in a classroom. It's getting very fundamental about how we understand the world, how we make meaning, and trying to think about new paradigms for that. Someone like Henry Jenkins, who was at MIT and now is at USC, he studies a lot of the ways that like fan communities remix Star Trek fan culture, or how cosplay fan communities, like what are they learning as they do cosplay, right? In other words, can we think about educational contexts that aren't in these traditional classrooms and things like that? So again, what I was saying with the toolbox idea, that's an idea that games are a democratic form of culture compared to many others. I feel that games blur the boundary between producers and consumers, and more of the games that I'm creating are meant to be hardwired for player creativity. The Quantum, the game that Abe mentioned, that's a game where player map making in a tabletop board game is an explicit part of the game with tips on how to create your own maps. It's kind of unusual in the like complex strategy game world, where you're usually taking a sort of a perfectly balanced machine and sort of just playing it. Another one is in the metagame, which I'm currently doing as a Kickstarter, shameless plug. But that's a deck of cards. It's a card system. It's like a game OS. And what we're hoping is that people design new games for our OS. So I'm totally with you. I think that games hopefully can work against that. But I'd also there's a dark side too. There's also a dark side to all this systems thinking stuff. Abe mentioned drones. I would also mention Scientology as a dark side of systems thinking, which I can go into more, but there's dangers too.
And I have a lot of thoughts about the dark side of systems thinking too, but Abe, you look like you were like thoughtful during that. You wanna jump in on that?
Yeah, I can't tell you who to design a game for to make money, because I mean, if I could, then man, I'd be rich already. But I can say I do have an optimistic opinion about the idea of Ludic Century and what would be
Why are we here?
Yeah, what would be a good example of if this paradigm shift changed and the ideology got adopted? And in a lot of activism and civic engagement, it's already playful and it's already gameful. When you look at things that people, organizations like Anonymous do and a lot of different types of civic. So you know what? Rather than feeding games back into, I'm totally like playing a communist on stage, rather than feed games back into the systems of power that we're all making our money off of, make games that are subversive, make games that are going to upend things, make games that are going to fuck with things.
But Abe, don't you see that all over the manifesto? Isn't that there when I'm comparing games to like culture hacking and I'm talking about
I think it's in there.
blurring the lines between?
It's in there deep, but then it needs to be a combination of hacking a computer and throwing shit against a wall, right? It can't just be, I'm going to destroy this bank with this computer that I got because I'm a middle class person in Ohio, right? It can't just be that. It's got to be games everywhere. And so I think that, and I know you a little bit, and I know you a little bit, and that's why I sort of said in the piece too, is like, I don't think that they're actually saying like, games for the empowered, or anything like that. So I do think it's in there, it's just.
Games for the empowered take quite well.
I think that's just an interesting point, the idea of play as an inherently sort of subversive activity. That was definitely one of the things that interested me when Eric and I were initially talking, was the idea that play is the pushback against the rules. And if we're going to live in this increasingly globalized world where we're all being spied on and other various nefarious things, this sort of knowing how to push back against the system that you live in, and that the rules that are imposed on you might actually be one of the things that helps keep us free, free.
Yeah, see, here's the funny thing about my point of view, which is that if you read Rules of Play, a book I wrote with Katie Salen, we define play as being free movement within a more rigid system. So there's some rigid system, whether it's how to walk and some kid is being playful by skipping and walking backwards, or whether it's language and someone is being playful by inventing slang and being subversive, and then that slang actually changes the language over time. So play is free movement within a more rigid system. As a game designer, I'm a huge advocate of play, of subverting systems, but I'm also an aesthete of rules, right? The weird thing about games is that they embody both this idea of subversive play, but also its opposite, which are these beautiful classical, mathematical, logical rules that in the case of games enable the play. And that actually, that weird paradox, that play happens in a game only because of these rules that hem us in, but then by playing within those rules, we often start playing with those rules. So I think that then that's why the Ludic Century Manifesto has this ambivalence in it. I mean, yes, it has these ideas of subversion, but it also has a kind of very classical, glorious love and admiration for games in and of themselves in the most classical, rule-bound way. And I think that's a contradiction. But that, to me, is the paradox that I can't resolve. That's like my Borges Aleph.
Maybe it's kind of balanced.
Well, yeah, I mean, that again, that's just my personal point of view. But that's why I'm not all games. I can't say games are all subversion. I mean, I love a beautiful classical game that's trying to do nothing more than provide some meaningful choices to players in an abstract system.
Other people. Oh, sorry, yes.
Hey,
yes.
I'm still here.
Yes. Your
Well,
face is not
well,
as expressive as Abe's.
We'll have to do something about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that I do when I'm not making games is I work with this group called Baby Castle, which tries to take games that other people make and put them somewhere where other people see them. And when we first started out, and this is, I would say, still largely true for us, is that we try to put them in places where people who don't think that games are for them would find them and love them. And I mean, because it started out like we put games on a folding table in the basement of an illegal music space. Like what I've learned from doing that, and the general advice that I give, like because oftentimes when people are saying like who do I make games for? Where do I find these people? Is what the problem is that they don't, like, if they already had those people, they'd be fine. They're like, I totally have an audience, I'm ready to go. But there's a question of like, where can I find people who engage with me as a game developer, as a player? And like I think that, and this actually maybe gets into a little bit of the sort of like the counterbalance to the commodification of games, is that for lack of a better term, the punk energy in game development is that if you can't find a scene that will have you build your own goddamn scene, and then you burn it down, and then you know, but then like your scene will crust over, and then like, you know, people who are slightly younger than you won't be able to get in the door anymore, and they'll have to go build their own scene, and they'll hate you, you know, for a little while, and then they'll be old too, and then you can all kind of reminisce. And that will just happen forever. You know, that's, you know, like as things commodify, like I don't know, some of the best game developers I've ever worked with were people I met working at EA, and now they're all working on Call of Duty. Like, it's not like these people like aren't talented and aren't psychotic, you know, and aren't like, you know, like jumping out of planes on the weekend, you know, but it's like that's like that doesn't have to be like that's just not what they express in games. But some people, that's what they need, you know, and that, you know, there will always be that churn, you know, as soon as things calcify, like new growth has to occur.
Right. All right, new ideas, new thoughts. Yeah.
So I completely agree with you that you know, that you have to keep in mind the rest of the world that doesn't really may not have access to these things. But at the same time, I agree with Eric because I do get that feeling.
Let's just end it there. I like it.
We'll have a time for reconciliation.
And at the risk of sounding hokey, that there is something in the air. Like I just don't remember. It just seemed to happen almost accidentally not overnight, but it feels like that. That, you know, 10 years or 15 years ago, I was like sitting in my living room playing, my dad told me to go to sleep, and now like everybody I know and everybody I don't know is playing games, including 65-year-old women who are going online to get a chance to win $1,000 because of playing games. And part of that, I think, is because of commodification, because not just the EAs of the world, but our company, for example, and other advertising agencies who create and found out that despite this being initially this niche of like nerddom, that this is an incredibly powerful tool to sell and distribute ideas and to make money on a much broader and bigger scale than ever. And because that happened, then it kind of came back because of the internet, and people started realizing, wait a minute, I can use the internet to make my own game and get it kickstarted or crowdsourced. And now games, all I see games becoming is the idea that you can figure out a way around anything. Because as long as you know that somebody has done that, and because we have the internet and people know that other people have done that, now they do it. The same way that, like, even your example of Nigeria, I feel like it's an example of them gaming their system. They don't have technology, but they have VCRs and they have vans. And they figured it out. And now they made a game out of their own system. They didn't have technology. Like, it'll happen no matter what. I think the idea is that
just to
the
agree
concepts
with you,
are like,
yeah,
are exploding.
That is a really great statement of what I think the core of what I'm trying to get at in this essay, which is that it's about literacies is not about technologies. It's about ways of thinking and literally about ways of creating and understanding meaning. And I think what you're saying about hacking through a system, finding exploits, that is exactly what I'm trying to get at. That I still think, I want to propose this in public. I would love to get a group of game designers together with government process policy experts and look at their exploits in our government. Gerrymandering, electoral districts, the filibuster. These are basically holes in a system, right? Someone designed the government. Wasn't really play tested well enough. They didn't weren't doing enough betas, right? But we need to fix these holes. I would love to get game designers together with policy people and be like, not to make a game that teaches you about something, but to apply game design thinking to these processes.
There was actually an article I read earlier this week talking about how, to your point of like the government wasn't beta tested enough. Like when you actually go and look at like where like new countries where constitutions are being written, none of those constitutions use the United States Constitution as well.
Right.
And it's not because they don't like the United States. It's because we don't have a very good constitution.
Right. We were the alpha.
Yeah,
we're the broken alpha.
I gotta say, none of this is new. Okay, so like your emerging market was playing bridge in the 1940s and 1950s. For some reason, games may have fallen a little bit out of favor, but now that group can access a computer. We were gaming. I watched Lincoln the other night. They passed the 13th Amendment because the South had seceded, so they tipped the scales in Congress, and they were able to push it. That's gaming the government system. None of this is new. What's new is an MFA program at NYU and a game center.
Exactly.
Which is a great thing. Don't get me wrong, but that's what's new.
That's something I always
is real, right? Language.
Yeah, but I guess it gets to the point that Abe was bringing up, is this something really new, or is it just a new way of talking about this in our show?
Yes and no.
So, I mean, I think the point that I was trying to make is that I was trying to imagine a world where it did mean something more than just like the way we talked about things. That there has to be like the experience of play and of working in the construct of the game would have to change the way our society works in some way, change the way that we think about life and relate to each other. I can imagine that being real. I think that there are like moments where like I see that. So at the risk of starting a semantic argument, the one problem that I have with some of the ways that you use the word designer, I think that as a game designer, game design is overrated, and that what we really need is sort of more something like a close plane. This I think is maybe related to some ideas about flow and things like that, where like when I part of the experience of the best games is losing myself in them. When I was at the Entertainment Technology Center at Carnegie Mellon, Randy Pausch talked about going to see Toy Story when it came out in theaters with a bunch of like, computer graphics PhDs. And the problem they had was that they kept getting wrapped up in the story, so they couldn't pay attention to the graphics. So they had to keep going. And they went like 5 times before they finally like were finished taking notes. Like the best games do that, right? The best games, to play them with your design hat on is to ruin the experience and miss the point of why they're so good. And I guess as like my last sort of point related to that is that I don't know if any of you are familiar with the concept of mask work from improvisational acting. It's this idea where when you put a mask on, you become the mask and you lose a sense of your own identity, and you suddenly start like walking around like limping and stuff like that because that's what your face says. I actually have a really easy time losing myself in things like that. Like when I go to sleep no more, I'm like hobbling around and I don't know why. But like for me, like that's like that's like peak play for me, is to have completely lost myself in the system and forgotten who I was and only sort of bring half memories out with me. And that's when I can put my design hat on and go, oh my God, what just happened? But like that is different for me than that sort of like smart, attentive, deconstructing while doing sort of play.
Well, I would say that if you look at animal behaviorists like Robert Fagan, that Brian Sutton Smith mentions in his book Ambiguity in Play, they define play as metacommunications. When animals play with each other, like when monkeys are play fighting, which let me demonstrate. When monkeys are play fighting, they're constantly communicating to each other. I'm not actually fighting with you, but of course they're also communicating, I'm fighting with you, because what they're doing is play fighting. So the dog, the dog is wagging its tail and smiling to show you that even as it's nipping another dog, it's also play fighting. So that I would say that play is not about being immersed or having this 1,000-point view and deconstructing the system. Play is that contradictory thing where we're in both states at once. That if we're playing a role-playing game, we're a character in that world, we're a player gaming the system, and we're also a person in the real world, all at the same time, moving between those levels. And it's that weird, multi-layered experience of a game. That is play. That is what the thing is, I think. So I'm less invested in this idea that pure play is the immersive, losing yourself kind of play.
Yeah, and touching on your question about, is it real or is it language? And Eric saying language is real, and I agree with Eric. And the thing is, it's what I it works. What I see as new is the language is a reflection of an ideology that is emerging out of academic institutions like this that are starting to take games seriously and starting to talk about games seriously. But what I fear, and what I really, really fear, and this is not made up, this is not something that people aren't doing. I fear the MIT Media Lab genius who says, you know what, rural librarian Chinese person, I'm going to solve your hunger problem with my game. You know what? No way. That's colonialism. Colonialism is forcing your ideology on other people, right? And so if we develop this new language and this new way of thinking about games, and we say, you know what, this is going to help you people because we figured it out in academia, then, and you know, what we should be doing is going, how do you play games? Right? Like, what are the games that are important to you? And a lot of people do that, you know, and actually, I mean, you do that. So, I mean, like, there's a lot of people who are out there saying, you know, what, but I fear there's a little bit of like this ramping of utopian rhetoric around games, like, we're gonna fix things, reality's broken.
But here's the thing.
I just use that phrase.
Right. One of the ways that we teach games at the Game Center, and also something I've learned from working with an architect, is that I'll be traveling somewhere with Natalie. We'll be giving a talk, and she'll say, she'll say, look at that building. I'll be looking at it. She says, well, really, it's so disagreeing with its site, right? And so it's like the idea that design is always situated, that the meaning emerges out of context. So I agree with you. There are people like Jessica Hammer, who recently gave a talk at the NYU Game Center. Now I actually think she's at the program that Randy Pausch started, right?
Yeah.
She's actually there. So
Yeah.
anyway, but Jessica Hammer talks about visiting third world developing country and looking at the games that are already played, and then saying how can they play with those games to work with NGOs to inculcate certain values or educate about disaster relief or work with young girls to increase the value of education and things like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Not interested.
You need to talk after the show with the people who were fist bumping when you said that.
So I'm sort of torn between wanting to ask if we need to bring in gamification, since you said
I don't want to.
Let's
I don't
go,
want to.
yeah.
I'm
No.
manifesto's good.
Yes,
I don't want to
audience,
get in there.
but
No, I'm just pointing to him because I don't know if you could see him yet his hand.
yeah.
I think you touched on an interesting point, which I think is maybe a dark side that might need to be explored, is that one of the inherent structures of games is that they are shaped to be explored in an understandable way, that all of the messiness and all the complexity is kind of confined into a system that can be interacted with predictably, and that is messing with people's heads, because they're starting to go out into messy systems sometimes and thinking, this is just like a game, I get this, I can pull these levers. And I think that might be something that you were starting to touch on, because that is the potential dark side, which I think can be addressed in the structure of games, just making sure, but I think that's something that as game designers we might need to address, just to say, you know, the real world is full of systems, but those systems are much less predictable than the systems that we're teaching you to interact with.
Yeah. And especially when you immerse them in culture, because then you end up with a guy who has the general manager of his football team tell him, you know what, you need to toughen up this guy because he's not playing tough enough, because toughness is something that matters to football. So at the lunch table, he yells at him and he tells him he's going to shit in his mouth. Right? And then the guy gets up because, you know, that's not a comfortable workplace condition. And we have half of the media, you know, audience in football saying, you know what, you should have just gotten up and punched him in the face. Because that's how we settle things when I play football. And we got the other half of people who are like, who can work like this? Which, as you can tell, is the obvious response. So, I mean, yes, games are, you know, in culture, and then culture messes with them and makes them.
But I think there are different models for what a game is. I mean, one model of a game is you enter this perfect cube and you interact with this high design system. Another model for a game is something like skateboarding. So a skateboard is this incredibly designed object, right? I mean, there's decades and different schools of thought. By the way, there's a huge, beautiful skateboard leaning against the wall. It's so large, it looks like, makes the room look like one of those weird perspective traps. Why is there a 10-foot skateboard? But then you take a skateboard and you improvise in the messy system of the city, right? And so that's another interesting model for a game. I was just at a conference in Zurich, and there's a group called Invisible Playground out of Berlin, and they do these very messy systems that are kind of broken and improvisational, and they're sort of halfway between games and sports and street theater. So I think there's lots of models, and I think that one of the things that again, places like NYU, what we're trying to do there is explode the idea of what a game can be. And so I feel like what we've explored in games in terms of subject matter, aesthetics, and especially gameplay, which means what happens in the game, but it also means how a game relates to the world outside or its context. We've just been looking at a little narrow slice of everything that might happen in the game.
So,
it's a really great point.
I was going to bring up a counter point, which is that I think that the reductionism that you're worried about is like a problem inherent in just the concept of education. We always use like toy systems so that we can feel some mastery, like Bohr model of the atom, obviously wrong, but we still teach it at some level because it has some usefulness. Sometimes there is that dark side because economists seem to think they know what they're doing, but it's also just like how we get a handle on things.
Sure. Okay. Are you familiar with the card game War? It's a card game children play. There are not a lot of like adults who sit around and play War. If you're not familiar with this game, you take a deck of cards, just a standard deck of cards, you divide it in half, and you just turn one card over. And whoever has the high card takes both cards. And if they match, you take another card off, and whoever has the high card takes all the face-up cards. You put them on the bottom of your stack, and then you win when you get all the cards. Now, what's so great about this game? Because it's random. Like, there's literally no skill involved. You're just watching stuff happen. So why do kids play this game? I think the reason why kids play War is because they don't know that they can't make the right card come up. They will sit there, if you play War with a kid who like really wants to play War with you, they will magic the fuck out of that card. They will sit there, or they'll pray to God, they'll try different gods, they'll run around the table and like jump up and down, like they'll do anything they can to make the high card come up for them. And it never works, or it almost never works, or it really sometimes only works. But the reason why we stopped playing War is we solved the game, right? And I think when you think about the games that you play as a kid that you don't play now, a lot of times it's because they're kind of boring. Like you see through them after a point. Like Chutes and Ladders is not that exciting anymore. Tic-tac-toe is not that exciting anymore. That's a good example. Checkers becomes less exciting when you get really good at chess. I think that there is something interesting, but not necessarily sinister, about these simplified systems and the lessons we learn when we discover their simplicity.
I bought that theory of games for a while until I had a son, because I was playing games and I was really enjoying playing NBA 2K or whatever, and then my son was born and he was really little, but then we started playing Peekaboo, and honestly that or a game like War, or a game where I ask him who he played with at school and he says Tubins. There's no kid at his school. But every time I ask him, he says it and he thinks it's hilarious. And these are now like the most fun games that I'm playing, right? Which just proves again that it's not just about the rules and the systems, right? The rule of Tubins is really weird, right? If I ask him who he went to school with, he says Tubins. If I don't, he says nothing. And I solved that real quickly. And he did too. But it's fun, right? I'm enjoying that. And those are engaging experiences and engaging games for me. And so I think it speaks to a bit of what Eric was sort of saying, is it's all just sort of like.
But that's how games as a cultural form open up into the sublime, meaning the kind of impossible to wrap your mind around aesthetic experience that in earlier eras of our history people maybe found landscape paintings or operas did. Games can have that too, whether it's for a child opening up into Peekaboo, which somehow reveals the mysteries of putting on a mask, taking it off, being hit in the room, or if you're a professional Go player, and the way that basically a simple set of rules and mathematics opens up into the deep mysteries of the universe that can never really be solved, even by human civilization so far, right? So I think that there's that is something of the sublime that's in games too. And I just want to put in my little note for saying that we talk a lot about games can change society in this way and oppose commodification in that way. I always want to leave room for saying that games don't need a justification, and this is how the Ludic Manifesto ends, that they're beautiful, and that I always want to say that we don't necessarily want to cheapen them by instrumentalizing them and saying they're only valuable because they solve some problem or help the world in some way. I also want to say that games like music or telling stories are intrinsically valuable because they're part of being human.
Let's take this one last question and then we're going to seek reconciliation.
So the concept of the Ludic Century has a lot to do that was brought up was the idea of turning players into someone like game designers and sort of changing how we sort of experience play. But that makes me sort of question, will that kind of change the definition of play? Because as I've sort of become a game designer, the way I go at games is a lot different than when I didn't know anything about them. They were very mysterious when I first started with them, but now as I'm starting to see oh, I get the systems now. Oh, I see the pieces sort of working together, and it's kind of changed how I've looked at games. And in some cases, I think it's maybe a bit more cynical of the systems at work, and I've lost some of the mystery. So I'm wondering.
I think that's Ben's point of view
yeah,
too.
so
about
I'm wondering if
the Toy Story.
that might be a downside of getting everyone into this mindset of, we should look at the design of games, but that might alter how we sort of experience play at a fundamental level.
I mean, it's a really interesting point. I studied filmmaking when I was studying painting, and I remember after you edit a little 16mm film, you will never see film again in the same way. You understand that editing is our sort of choices that you make. The invisible language of cinema, you start to gain some sense of how it's structured. But for me, that didn't stop me from becoming emotionally engaged in films. It merely added another layer of my possible depth of appreciation for them. So I guess that's my answer to that. Is that for me, adding more ways to appreciate a cultural form does not diminish it. It expands it, and I think might make it more challenging to find that kind of romantic space. But I actually think that's just, and I'm not saying that there's something simple-minded about this immersion into something and that's what we want to do and forget about how it's structured. I think it's more important to understand that people make shit and that shit is structured in a certain way for better or for worse. And if I think about politics and you think about why the US went to war in the Middle East, it was narratives about good guys and bad guys and saving or colonialist narratives. And I just think that once you get there, of course, you're embroiled in these incredibly complicated sectarian conflicts that go over generations. And to me, I associate this sort of romantic thinking of experience of media with a simplistic way of looking at the world. That's my own personal feeling, and I think that it's possible both to have a deconstructed idea of the world, which is totally fascistic, like Scientology or something. So I'm not saying that design thinking is the answer to everything, but I think that adding those layers for me is a good thing in balance.
One of the things that I spend too much time worrying about is that I will become one of those people who thinks that they don't make good music anymore. And I think that I hate people who say things like that. That they drive me crazy because there's obviously so much good music being made. But I'm also sort of aware of how much effort I have to put in to staying current and following and going to shows where I don't know any of the bands and probably 80% of the time it's gonna just suck, it's I don't know, for me it's kind of things get exhausted and you it feels like you've seen all the tricks that there are, and I don't know, you have to decide sort of the mediums you want to kind of keep up on, because there's certainly plenty of stuff that I don't, and really push and so if it's video games, doing Baby Castle stuff, it involves going to a lot of really gross internet forums and finding links to some dude's FTP site, and then using a computer that you don't care if it gets a virus, because sometimes that happens too, and but it's there's a to really find to stay on the cutting edge of things and to keep kind of chasing those amazing first time revolutionary cathartic experiences. I mean, it is a lot of work, And like the more stuff I have to do, like the harder it is to justify spending the time to be like one of the cool kids.
It's over.
Yeah.
So just to try to wrap this up, I guess, in some way, we've been here a long time. Does anyone have any like burning question they're just gonna drop dead if they don't get to ask? Yeah.
Hey, alright, I'm not a game designer, I'm a musician, so I'm surprised I'm even brave enough to talk right now. But just from sitting and listening to the three of you, what I came away with was that ludic thinking has pretty much always existed. We're just now awakening to the fact that we do think this way, and we're just harnessing it and utilizing it in society and in social interactions and with helping with poverty and tragic events. Would you agree with that? Like, I feel like that's kind of something that was a theme that was going around. You were talking about people going to Africa and learning how they play games and how we all use games in our lives in different ways. Because there's problem solving is basically a game, and resource gathering is basically a game, and I think those are all things that we can use and have always existed. Is that something that you agree with?
Yeah, well, and I can answer that as a segue into some of my closing thoughts, actually. But I agree with the first bit that you said, which was that, and actually the two ends of the manifesto, which is that games are ancient and games are their own justification, I think are the two most important parts of the manifesto. We're not entering a ludic century. We have been in a ludic period of humanity since the very, very, very beginning. We have always used games to make sense of the world, to create metaphors for our world, whether it's the cross of war, whether it's something as simple as peekaboo, which channels, a small child's understanding of their space in the universe. Because at first they don't understand that when you disappear, you're not gone, right? So we have always had these games to kind of structure our understanding and help us make sense of the world that we have been in. And so, from my cultural studies and media history background, I would encourage, instead of thinking of dramatic paradigm shifts of, this is a big change now, we have some different tools today to create these metaphors and create these experiences and to kind of design these sort of things. But instead of thinking of paradigm change, think in terms of continuity. We have always been doing this, and so what are the new things that we're doing now that are just like the things that we were doing before, but just a little bit different? Or what are the new technologies that we're using, and what are kind of the new ways we're thinking about it? And then, of course, how does all of that fit into the long historical change of and historical story of power relationships throughout the world? Because you can't escape those, whether it's class, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's geopolitics. You can never escape those things. So you always have to place that in that framework as well.
That's super interesting. I guess I sort of wanted to close by posing a question to Eric and then see if I can get some buy-in from you guys on our reconciliation days. So the word bombastic has come up a couple times today, and Eric says pretty clearly, he chose the manifesto as a bombastic device to put these ideas out there. He loves to be criticized, so we hung it out there like a little magnet and all this crap and all to come and get him. So strip all that away, right? No bombasticity. What are you saying in just a few sentences? What do you actually mean? No devices, no being clever, just what do you actually believe is happening here?
I'm trying to appreciate two things. One, trying to understand how games are beautiful as a form of culture. And the second thing is, I'm trying to understand how games fit into these times in which we're living.
So then I would sort of ask you guys, how much do you feel like you were reacting to the bombasticity, and how much you expressed more clearly like that and you sort of stripped down way, you basically buy into these ideas, or you still feel like no?
Well, I think my response started out as just a reaction to using the word manifesto.
but
Yeah.
I would love to see the Ludic Century a sestina.
Well, subtlety is so accurate, but it's far less entertaining.
We would like to do it now.
Yes.
Exactly.
So then we're all reconciled.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think part of my reaction was to the bombast, and some of it is also a genuine concern I have for you know the notion that games are new. I hear this all the time, and even though the first line was games are ancient, which I think was really important, it segued immediately into, but they have a new relevance because of digital technologies. And I'm like, no, they don't. Okay. Sports have been around since forever. All games have always been around since forever. Maybe we didn't have Call of Duty 200 years ago, but we had war games 200 years ago. And so again, thinking in terms of continuity is really important. Things change. I'm not a Luddite. I don't hate technology. I don't think that there's not change. There's projectors, there's new technology, but I always think useful to think in terms of continuity. And actually, now that you framed it the way you said, thinking about it in terms of now, I think there's an assumption of the long, the sort of long tail of history that preceded it. Tail's usually after the long head.
Long head.
I don't know what the, so I just made that up. The long neck of history.
I think that those are great points, and to address your excellent question, Matthew Arnold, I think the literary critic, right, 19th century or early 20th century, he said that to really be a sort of an outstanding writer, you had to be two things. You had to be both sort of imminently of your moment, part of history, part of the continuity of everything that came before, and at the same time, you have to be doing something new. You have to be reaching out, you have to be reinventing history, reinventing writing in this case, and I think I'm of those two minds, right? I want to celebrate the continuity, the ancient continuity of games, and I also want to think about what is new about them and how do they relate to these times in which we live today, and how can we appreciate the ways that they're uniquely beautiful.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Yeah.